All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third session of the Power of Negotiation and Communication. I'm Jessica Grosskopf, a regional extension economist with Nebraska Extension, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mykel Taylor. Mykel joined the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology as the Alpha Endowed Eminent Scholar and Associate Professor in January of 2021. Her research interests broadly include markets for agricultural land, leasing, and farm management. As an endowed scholar, her role is to provide leadership in research and outreach in partnership with the University of Alabama Cooperative Extension System and state, national, and international organizations and stakeholders. She previously held research and extension positions at Kansas State University and Washington State University. She received her PhD from North Carolina State University and her Master of Science and Bachelor's of Science from Montana State University. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Mykel Taylor.
Looks great. Okay, wonderful. So as you probably gathered from Jessica's introduction, which I really appreciate, is that I have been all over the country. And I have lived in many different states, originally from Montana, and now down here in Alabama at Auburn University. And one of the things that I have discovered in my travels around and working with people in agriculture is that while there are vast differences in what we grow and the way that we grow it, there is a lot that we have in common. And one of the topics that I would say we have the most in common with is this idea of interacting between landowners and tenants. And so tonight, what I want to talk about are some of those relationships. This is coming from information that I gathered from years of working at Kansas State University as an extension economist, and then from some research projects that we've done over the last few years in both Kansas and Missouri and in some other states. And so I hope that we get the opportunity to interact at the end of this, and but just to keep me on track, I will get rolling. So the first thing I want to talk about is leasing arrangements, and just take a moment to sort of refresh ourselves as to what we're talking about when we talk about different types of leasing arrangements. So the traditional leasing arrangement is either a crop share or a fixed cash rent, and occasionally a net share lease will fall into those traditional. And then we also have hybrid leases, which are flex leases or fixed cash rents with a bonus. So I always put these couple of slides up here just to make sure that we're all talking about the same kind of thing. On crop share leases, the farmer and the landowner share risk. So whether that's production risk, commodity price risk, or input price risk, there's a sharing component to that. And management decisions tend to be made jointly or with a lot of communication, and technology adoption may affect the arrangement. So when we saw no-till come into Kansas, that affected some people's arrangements of who was paying for what in those crop share leases. In fixed cash leases, farmer takes on the majority of the risk. The payments are made regardless of production prices or cost. And management decisions do not typically involve the landowner. In fact, oftentimes what I'll have people tell me is that, well, you know, with a fixed cash lease, we get to December, we write the check, we stick it in the Christmas card, and we drop it in the mail, and that's the extent of our communication. And it's easy to see that potentially happening with a fixed cash lease, because there is not a lot of involvement by landowners in management decisions. So that can happen sometimes. And then with flex leases, we have a fixed cash component, which we agree to prior to the production year. And then we flex on sources of risk, and it can depend on how you set up the lease, whether or not you're going to flex on production, market prices, or revenue. And the thing about it is, if you put crop share arrangements on one end of the spectrum and fixed cash leases on the other end of the spectrum, these flex leases would be somewhere in between, where they're a hybrid of the other two leases. So they can be really good, but what they tend to be is very complicated. There's no one way to do a flex lease. And so what we find is that very few people actually use them. This is the 2014 USDA NASS total survey. which was a landowner survey. So it's a very unusual one for NAS to do. Usually NAS is surveying farmers. And for this one, they surveyed landowners. And so what they found was that the majority of leases that we see in the Great Plains and the Midwest are cash leases. And there's a pretty big chunk in the Great Plains, 25% that are share, and about 15% in the Midwest that are share leases. And then the flex leases make up just the residual. Something that we've noticed, and this is again data from Kansas, is the trend in the use of cash leases is that it's been trending up over time. And so over the past 20 years, we've seen where we went from having a lot of crop share leases to where we're starting to have more fixed cash leases. And so why is that happening? Well, a couple of things could be going on. One is that the risk profile that farmers face has been altered by crop insurance. So their need for crop share is a little less, given that they've got crop insurance to back them up on their revenue side or on their yield side. We also see that we have landowners wanting a guaranteed income and being less willing to participate in that share arrangement. And then the other thing that we're seeing happening is that landowners are becoming what we call generationally and geographically removed from farming. So what you have is that whereas it used to be that you rented from your neighbor, now you're renting from your neighbor's kids, and those neighbors' kids might not live in the same county or the same town. They might be the next state over. So the further that they become removed from agriculture and the less they understand about it, the more interested they tend to be in a fixed cash lease. And then producers' management of multiple leases and landowners. If we're going to get bigger in agriculture, then we have to take on more acres. And one of the ways that we do that is by taking on more leases. And so then that means you've got more landowners to deal with. And interestingly enough, in Miami County, I was visiting with a gentleman who was farming there, and he had put together, I don't know how many acres he farmed. He didn't tell me that much, but he did tell me that he had over 90 landowners. And so that's a county where you put together a lot of small farms to make up a large farm. And 90 landowners is such that I asked him, I said, well, do you do crop share with any of them? And he said, no, absolutely not. I just do fixed cash lease. And I communicate with them, via a newsletter. And so those transaction costs make it such that a lot of people are starting to choose fixed cash leases, and we find them to be more common. They're also a little easier to bid on. So if you are familiar with any of the lease auctions, that's how they are being set up, as in a fixed cash lease arrangement. So I became a landowner when I was 21 years old. And that was a really formative experience for me, because my dad passed away and he left the ranch to my brother and I, and my brother was younger than me. And so I kind of took on this responsibility. And that led me, when I went into research and extension in agricultural economics, to be kind of fascinated by leasing relationships. And so I've done a lot of work in this area, and I've talked to a lot of people. And that's one of the things that I kind of miss about tonight, is that I won't have the chance to drink coffee with you afterwards and hear your stories. But I would be very open to hearing your stories via email if you're willing to share them. So let's talk a little bit about leasing relationships. This is from some survey data that we did in Kansas, but I can assure you that from information that I've gathered from other folks in different states, there's going to be a lot of similarities, maybe some slight differences, but a lot of similarities. So demographic information. We asked, this survey was talking to farmers, and we asked them their gender. And so it's probably not surprising to you that most of the primary operators that we surveyed were men. And so they identified themselves as, like I said, the primary operator. And we had a few women primary operators, but most of them were men. Now, what may not surprise you is that women make up a much larger percentage of the landowner group. And in fact, in the Great Plains, it's about 43%, and in the Midwest, it's about 35%. And in our survey, you can see the breakdown. There was about 1/3, 2/3. Male versus or female versus male. And does this matter for relationships? I want you to think about how you negotiate and how you talk with somebody in a business partnership versus maybe how your husband or your dad or your brother might talk to somebody in a business relationship. And, sometimes it gets a little awkward in the room when I say, does it matter, if you're talking to a man or a woman when you're talking about negotiations? And it's like, it actually does. Women will negotiate differently than men. And in fact, I had a woman come up to me and she said she was a landowner in Kansas. And she's told me that one of the frustrating things to her about having these negotiations and these dealings with her tenant was that he always talked to her husband. And that frustrated her because she was the one that actually owned the land. But that tenant was more comfortable talking to her husband. And so, we kind of got to say, well, that's something that you probably want to talk with your husband about and then talk with your tenant about, right? But she was a little frustrated. And then we got to talking about the fact that, how would it make you feel as a landowner if your tenant talked to you and came and, let's say, for example, picked you up one day from the house and drove you out to the farm and drove you around and told you about all the things that they were planning on doing with their farm or with your farm and their ideas for conservation work or, other forms of improvements and their long-term plan for farming, and just talk to you about that. And this gal that I was talking to, she said, well, that would be wonderful. She said, you know what? She said, I'd bake them cookies. That's how great that would be. And I said, well, and you'd probably keep them on as a tenant, wouldn't you? And she said, yes, absolutely, because they are talking to me and not my husband. So what else do we know demographic information? Well, farmers tend to be about average age in their late 50s. And we have an aging demographic in terms of our farmer population, something that a technology is allowing farmers to work longer. We're no longer farming with tractors that have open cabs. We have the ability to farm and have auto steer and things like that allow farmers to keep working longer. And one of the other things that we have to think about is that depending on how good the economic situation is, sometimes that can delay succession plans if we've had some bad economic years. If things are going well, it can speed up succession plans, but the ability of a farmer to retire may be affected by the current economic situation. Now, what about the demographics of our landowner? Well, the average age of a landowner is 72, 73 years old. And that's considerably older than somebody in their late 50s, who's our average age of our tenant. So we have an age differential between tenants and landowners. And it's something that comes because, landowners don't typically have the capital to invest in farmland until later in life, or you end up inheriting from your parents. And so we just tend to see landowners be of an older age. It was very unusual for me, in fact, to become a landowner when I was only in my 20s. And I only occasionally run into young people that are landlords or landowners. The implications of having landowners that are in their 70s and 80s is that we may have to adjust the way that we communicate with them. Texting may or may not be the best way to communicate with them. I always, tell my students, I said, okay, here's that phone. I said, do you actually ever use it to call anybody, or do you just use it to Snapchat? And so we talk about how you have to make a phone call or perhaps write a letter. And also thinking about some of these folks being retired and on a fixed income where they may prefer a fixed cash lease. So there's some implications of their age. Proximity of landowners. Where do the landowners live? So about a quarter of them live on the farm, a quarter of them in the same county, a quarter of them are outside the county but the same state, and about a quarter of them are outside of the state. And that has implications for things like communication, whether or not you can just drive down the road and visit with them in person, or you're bound to see them at the grocery store or at church, or if you're going to have to make an effort because they live out of county or out of state. The other thing is that we sometimes see generational distance from the farm. Like I mentioned earlier, you might have always been renting from your neighbors, but now you're actually renting from their kids or their grandkids. And that generational distance from the farm can be reflected in physical distance from the farm. And so it can affect their perceptions of commercial agriculture and their understanding of farm practices and farm policy and commodity markets. And by that, I mean, as land changes hands and goes to the next generation, you can have situations where I had a farmer in Northwest Kansas who called me and said, I have a new landowner. It just changed hands. It went, to the next generation, and they want me to farm organically. And that's not what I do. How do I talk to them? How do I tell them what I do and not have to lose this lease because I don't farm organically? And that was just something that was sort of out of the blue and they weren't expecting. So those things can happen. How did the landowner obtain the land? So, roughly 55% inherited it and the rest purchased it. Do you think that there's a difference in the way landowners treat a lease arrangement if they inherited land versus if they purchased it? Now let's think about that for a second. If you purchase something, a piece of land, and you look at it as an investment, you may really have an attitude where I'm looking for a return on my investment. This is a business transaction, and my tenant needs to do the following things in order to make this work. Whereas if you inherit a piece of land, you could easily be in a situation where you're like, well, I want to do it the way dad did it, or I want to do it the way mom did it, or I don't want to rock the boat. And we've been, farming with these same families for the last couple of generations. And so there's a lot of baggage that comes along with inherited land. And so it can really be interesting. Like I said, when I inherited land from my dad, I was in college at the time and I had taken an ag law class and I thought, oh, I know everything, right? I'm so smart. And so my ag law professor had told me, well, you have to have a written lease. And so he gave me a form for a written lease and I filled in some of the blanks and I called up my dad's tenant, who I was fully interested in leasing to as well. His name was Bob. And I called Bob and I said, I've got this written lease and I've filled out some of the forms, but I need you to fill out some of the other parts of it. Can I mail it to you and will you take a look? And there was silence on the other end of the phone. And he said, finally, don't you trust me? He said, your dad leased to me for years. And now you want a written lease, and we did everything on a handshake, and you want a written lease. And so there was this immediate sort of misunderstanding that just came from the fact that I had inherited the land and I had not been the landowner, for previously. And so we really needed to work that out. Now we did, and it was no problem, but those are the kinds of things that can pop up. All right, let's talk about some lease information. How often do you meet or interact with your landowner? I'm going to sort of beat a dead horse when I say it over and over in this presentation, but communication is the key to relationships. And I don't want to sound hypocritical. My husband and I have a great marriage, but our idea of a good time is he sits on the couch and watches football and I work on an Excel spreadsheet and we don't talk. So that's our idea of a good time. But in reality, communication is the key to a good relationship, right? So we need to keep our landowners updated on farming practices and market conditions. And that's going to help when we have some of those tough talks on negotiating where we're trying to get to a mutually beneficial situation. We need to keep them informed. Who do you lease from? So if you lease from an individual versus a group versus a trust or other, and the other category could be from like state or school township lands or something like that, publicly owned lands. So those are the four categories. And so communication is going to be different when you have these different relationships with people. So the conversation with an individual who say maybe is a neighbor versus going and talking to the banker or lawyer that represents the trust that you rent from. Also group dynamics. When you're renting from a group of siblings, they oftentimes will sort of nominate somebody to be the primary person, but you're still dealing with a group of siblings and they could have some very different ideas about how to manage that farm. So that can make for some interesting conversations. Is a landowner a retired farmer or rancher? So maybe their perceptions of commercial farming have changed. If they farmed themselves, they might have certain ideas about how things need to be done, versus if they've never farmed before, they might not have any ideas about what things need to be done. And there's good and bad in terms of how you deal with them and how you approach things that you want to do on their farm that might be changes. Some of those folks will be more responsive to that than others. How long have you been renting from this person or entity was a question that we asked people, and the average leasing relationship was almost 18 years. It's basically generational leasing. And what I mean by that is that we will get into a leasing relationship and it will take a lot for us to break it. And oftentimes, I've met several families who have been renting from each other for 4 and 5 generations. And they're very proud of that. And that is something to be proud of. It's also not something to take for granted. If you become the next tenant or you become the next landowner, is that you still have to work hard at that relationship to make sure that it goes forward for another generation. And then how many landlords do you have? You can see in this distribution here, the most common is between 3 and 5, so about 4 landlords. But we've got some folks who have as many as 30 or even out to 50. And so communication gets harder when you have to talk to more people. And so this idea of using a newsletter or some kind of group communication is a really a good one. And I had a friend of ours who was a producer, and he had a daughter who was just starting college, and she was looking to want to come back to the farm, and she was trying to dip her toe in different things that she could do. And he just identified that she had some skills to be able to communicate with landowners. And so he wanted her to set up their newsletter and put together the information that he thought those landowners might be interested in. And that was a skill set that she had. So it was a way for him to sort of bring her into learning how to interact with landowners, as a tenant. So that's something that you could look at doing. And then leasing in practice. So here's some things. Here's some things to think about with regard to what we've learned from those surveys. So communication by the tenant is incredibly important. And as a landowner, you want to be open and responsive to that communication. You want to learn about current market conditions and new technologies and farm policy and conservation practices. And remember that as a tenant, you have the bulk of that information. Your landowner may or may not even know where to go to get that kind of information. So you want to be a good source for them. The preferences for fixed cash leases by landowners, we've talked about, why that may be the case, and that it reduces the information burden. And then transition plans by aging landowners and tenants. So we have, in extension, we have a tremendous number of programs for succession planning for farmers, getting to that next generation, because there's a lot of legal and financial aspects to it and communication aspects to it. But there's also needs to be a transition plan between landowners and their next generation and the tenants that they lease to. So what I suggest is that if you don't know who your landowner is going to leave the place to, or even if you do and you don't know them very well, let's say they're going to leave it to their kids, and they have a couple of kids, and you maybe want to make the offer to say, hey, when the kids are home for Christmas this year, why don't you bring them by and we can drive them around the place and we can talk and have a conversation about what we're doing here and why we're doing it. And give that next generation the opportunity to meet the tenant and understand some of the things that are going on, so that when and if that land changes hands, you have the opportunity to say, okay, I know who you are and I'm familiar with you. You're not a complete stranger. I mean, I had a gentleman who stopped in my office on his way from Western Kansas to Kansas City, and he was a producer, and I wasn't used to seeing him in dressed up clothes, and he was all dressed up. And I asked him, I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm headed to the funeral. I need to meet the next generation. And he didn't know the kids. And that's a really tough, you don't want to meet them at the funeral. So that's a tough situation. Okay, so how do you view the other person? So I'm going to put yourself in the other person's shoes. My landlord doesn't need to know the yields because they might raise the rent on me. My landlord is wealthy and doesn't need more rent from me. My landlord can take the land away at any time. These are things that people have said. And the reality is that they should know the yields. They should know what's going on the farm, because they might take it away from you if you don't share that information with them. And really, their wealth is not a relevant thing when it comes to this business partnership that you've entered into with them, where you're trying to both be better off from the situation. And they can take the land away at any time. Yes, that's true. Although I have seen a lot of landowners put up with a lot before they will take away a piece of land. My tenant doesn't make a lot of money farming and has a family to support. They're the only person I know who would be willing to rent my land. They rented from my parents, and I have an obligation to keep this lease in the family, and they don't have time to explain farming to me. Again, comments that I've heard from people, and there's a lot of untruth in them, even though that might be a perception that you have. Wealth doesn't matter. This, again, is a business relationship that you enter into, trying to make both parties better off. The only person I know who'd be willing to rent my land, no, there are other people. And sometimes it's just a matter of looking around and making it known that you're looking for somebody and making the opportunity, better for you than renting to somebody who you don't have a good relationship with. And that doesn't have time to explain farming to me. I had a lady come up to me after a meeting where we were talking about this subject of leasing. And she said, I really wish I knew more about my farm and what my farmer was doing, and how what his approach was and how he was doing things. But she said, I know he's really busy and I just don't think he would have time. And I said, he's probably renting 400 acres from you. He's got time to have a cup of coffee with you and answer your questions. You just have to ask. And as a tenant, you have to be willing to make the offer and take that time. So again, I keep referring to this as a business partnership, and I think that's what it is. And full information is going to help you set an equitable rent. So as long as you're willing to share yields and production cost and market price information, it gives both parties a basis for negotiating rents. Trying to withhold information and be there are strategies for negotiation, and I know you're going to talk about those a little bit in this program, but there's a lot of information that we just don't seem to be willing to share that is not proprietary. It's information like yields and you could even, if you don't want to provide your own production costs, you could look at costs from, for example, KFMA or USDA, which puts out production cost information so that you can kind of show a landowner, look, production costs, for example, have been up the last 2 years because of input costs, and explain to them so that you can provide that information rather than just having them take your word for it that it's tough because input costs are higher. And then finding a new tenant, search costs for the landowner will keep them from switching often, but that doesn't mean that we need to take advantage of that situation. So landowner mistakes, I'll pick on the landowners for a minute. The first one is failing to communicate with the tenant, failing to call and have a conversation. There are some landowners who are just really reluctant to talk to their tenant. Sometimes it's because they don't know very much about agriculture and they're a little bit intimidated by their farmer. And they shouldn't be, but they are. Another one is affecting the usability of the land and not compensating the tenant, or expecting certain production practices that may not be profit maximizing, or expecting a high rate of return based on what they paid for land and not the rental market. And then the last one is expecting the current tenant to make up for the mistakes of past tenants. And it's what happens, but it really shouldn't. We should give them a clean slate and the opportunity to make a good relationship. So you'll notice the first one there was failing to communicate with the tenant. When I switch and I do tenant mistakes, the first one is failing to communicate with the landowner. So I'll put it back on them. It's a two-way street. Another mistake that tenants will sometimes make is using an informal bonus during good years. And that seems a little bit counterintuitive. Why wouldn't I give a bonus if I had a good year? Well, the problem with it is if you don't explain and show how you calculated that bonus and how it's based on the current profitability or the current market prices or something that is objective, then what's going to happen is the next year when that situation doesn't arise and you choose not to give them that informal bonus, they've built in this expectation that, hey, I'm going to get a bonus. And they don't know why they don't get a bonus, and it can cause some hard feelings. Treating the current landowner as less than a full business partner, the next generation may not appreciate this very much. And then there's the idea of using foot in the door payments and finding out they aren't profitable, and then not raising the rent along with the market trends because you paid too much to get into the land in the first place. So those are just some things that we've seen happen in some of the places around Kansas and surrounding states. So here's a hypothetical. You currently get $100 an acre for your land. A 30-year-old farmer offers you $100 an acre, and a 60-year-old farmer offers you $110. Who do you rent to and why? This was a question that we asked a group of landowners. Ray Massey, who is going to be one of your speakers, I think he's still coming up, but Ray and I had a meeting in Kansas City where we had Missouri and Kansas landowners, and we got them in the room, and at the beginning of the meeting, we kind of got onto the topic of renting to young farmers, and they all said, oh yeah, that's great. And we would definitely want to rent to young farmers. And then we got to this question. And we asked it using clickers so that they could respond anonymously. And what was interesting was that a group of people who, when they were talking all together, said we would definitely want to rent to, the young farmer. They were split when they answered anonymously, and only about half of them said that they would rent to the young farmer, and the other half said no, I would rent to the older farmer. And one of the questions was, or one of the comments that we got back from them when we asked them why this was the case, was the idea of experience versus transparency. And so their biggest concern was the risk factor, the financial risk exposure that they might get with working with a young farmer who may not have as much experience, and whether or not they were as well capitalized in their business as a 60-year-old farmer might be. And so they felt like they were taking on some additional risk with renting to that younger farmer. And so that made them a little bit nervous. The other thing that they kind of talked about was this idea of building trust and what we call social capital, but it's basically building trust with another person in a relationship. And we just made, kind of had the conversation that you have the opportunity to build a lifelong relationship with that 30-year-old farmer if you pick the right one. And so there's that opportunity over time to work with the same person. And that trust thing is a big deal. Especially if you're an absentee landowner, you really want somebody who's not just paying the bill, but who's also taking care of your land and doing things to help it be in the best shape possible going forward. Now, we've done some research in Kansas where we asked sort of these hypothetical questions about how much you would be willing to rent to a young farmer versus an older farmer based on experience, not just on age, but on years of experience. And one of the things we found from that research is that indeed young farmers would actually have to pay more in order to get a landowner to rent to them. And I think it's because of this idea of risk that the young farmer has for whether or not they're as financially stable as the older farmer. So landowners are very risk aware. And so, if you make the conscious decision to rent to a young person, sometimes those arrangements involve a little more transparency, where you might have them, talk to you a little bit more about, their cost of production and their, not their financial situation, but a little bit more information than you might ask from a 60-year-old farmer. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about as to whether or not that's something you'd be willing to do, and why, and what as a young farmer you would need to offer to a potential landowner in order to get the opportunity to lease their land. One of the other things we've talked about with young farmers is basically putting together a resume for a landowner with professional and personal references and farming philosophies and experience and education, and presenting yourself in the most professional way possible so that you make the best impression and give that landowner the idea that you are a serious professional in this industry. So lots of things we've looked at there. Here's a question. Who has more power in negotiating the terms of a lease? Now, generally, when we ask this question, we get the same answer. And here it is, the landowner. That's who most people think has more power in negotiating the terms of a lease. Okay, but there's a little more balance to this negotiating than what you may think at first glance. Farmers tend to have better information. They tend to know more about the rental rates and their for their leases, and also what they hear in the coffee shop, and what they know where to find information on rental rates. They know where to find market and production conditions. They know technology and government programs. And with that information, they can be strong negotiators. But landowners do tend to have the land. And so that is an aspect of this dynamic that we like to study, that kind of gets at, okay, who really does have the power in these negotiations? And it's not clear that one group or the other is the dominant force in these negotiations. All right, where to from here? So let's wrap this up and then get to an opportunity to have some questions. So what affects your land's value when it comes to renting it? How can it be used? Crop rotations, grazing plans? What factors affect its value? Tillage practices and weed control. And so things that are specific to your piece of land, and that you need to understand that your land might rent for a different amount than the land down the road, simply because of the condition of the type of soil, the condition, if it's pasture, the condition of the fences, or any number of different things that are going to affect its productivity. So that's going to affect what it can rent for. And then who are your potential renters? Location is really important. You don't always have to rent to the neighbor, but the neighbor is very convenient and often willing to pay you a bit of a premium, because they have land that's very close by, and it's easy for them to farm. But there are other options, okay? And so there needs to be a willingness to search for new renters, if that's what you need to do. Knowing what's going on in the market. So you've made a very good investment in your time, I hope. In coming to these extension meetings, I really, if you're a farmer, reaching out to your landowners and telling them about these kinds of presentations and these kinds of workshops, they might be really interested in it and not even realize that they're offered, because oftentimes extension is geared towards producers, and we have to kind of bring in our landowners and let them know that it's going on. Ag Lease 101 is a website that, if you've never been there, it's worth going to it. It has lots of example leases that you could use if you're going to use a written lease on your farm. So you're not starting from scratch and not sure what would be the right thing to put in it. So there's crop share leases and fixed cash leases, and I believe there's also flex leases that are examples that you can use. And then I have had people come up to me and say, look, as a landowner, I appreciate hearing all of this information, but this is just more than what I want to do. And so the idea of a professional farm manager is not out of the question by any means. And for some landowners, that is the direction they need to go. Especially an example would be if you're trying to manage a piece of property across several siblings, and it's hard or impossible for one sibling to be the liaison. Farm managers can help with that dynamic. So that's an option that you always have. And what in closing, I'll say, invest your time to improve the leasing relationship. It will pay dividends for you in longevity of the lease, and in sort of the quality of the relationship that you have. And when you find the landlord or tenant who works well with you, follow the advice of the lady in Kansas and bake them cookies. All right, so let's move to the Q&A. Jessica, just tell me what you want me to do in terms of if I leave my screen shared or if you want me to unshare.
It's up to you. Again, I would encourage you, if you have any questions for Mykel, if you would put those in the chat and make sure that you send them to everyone so that we can keep track of those. The first question that came in is, could you provide ideas or resources for putting together or developing a newsletter?
Oh, Okay, so I'm going to stop share so that I can see everybody's faces. So I don't necessarily have a specific resource for you for a newsletter. I have seen some different farms who have done everything from websites to newsletters, but that's a good question. And gosh, I don't personally know one, but Jessica, that may be a good output for for an extension publication.
Yeah, I think there's some important things though that we can share in that newsletter, and thinking about creative ways that we can think about how we're sharing, weather updates, things that are going on the operation. And there are a lot of platforms that are out there, whether that's Constant Contact or something like that, that can automate some of that for you on your behalf. So something to think about. Maybe we'll be able to get our heads together for those of us who are helping put this together, and maybe come up with some more answers for that. Our next question is, what complications are there when the tenant lives on the farm, in the house on the farm?
Well, then you're renting out a house and farmland. And so, yes, that can complicate things because you have two different kinds of leases going on there. You've got the personal residence and you've got the farm. And this is where I'll just say that I think that, trying to keep those two leases separate and have them be written, and so that the expectations of what they're going to be as a tenant in the house is one thing, and then having the written lease for the farmland as something different. And again, talking to them, keeping up good communication with them is going to be really important, because they're leasing two assets from you, both a house and a piece of land. And so that's what I would recommend, is that you have two separate leases listed for them, to try to keep it as clear as possible what your expectations are for those two different arrangements.
So the next question in the chat is, where does a person find a farm manager?
Oh, Google it. Farmers National, based out of Omaha, would be one place to start. People's Company, which is based out of Iowa, I believe, or Illinois. I'm not sure which it is. Those are two that would be, they're big ones. A lot of ag banks will have farm managers that work and manage assets and that the bank owns. And so that might be another way. So you could talk to a local ag bank, and they might know someone as well. But a good Google search would give you some ideas in your area of where a farm manager would be.
I would also recommend you check with your local extension office. We're usually pretty familiar with the farm managers that are in a local area. How do you go about finding a good tenant?
You want somebody that meets your expectations, so that when you sit down with them and you have a conversation with them, they are talking along the same lines or having the same ideas that you do. So if you sit down with them and you say, okay, well, I would like to be able to, get a newsletter, or I would like an update of what's going on, and they kind of balk at that a little bit, that's somebody that you probably don't want to lease. You want to, basically, I would say, take the time to do an interview. And take the time. This is where we talk to our young farmers and say, have a resume. As a landowner, you want to look at your options, and you want to get some personal references or professional references for some of the people that you're looking at leasing to. So asking them, who else do you lease from? And could I talk to that person? And, some people are going to say, yeah, no problem. And they're going to be very forthcoming with that information. And other people are going to say, no, I'm not sure I want to do that. And that might be a red flag for you, that's not somebody that you want to lease to. But I think what's most important is that you find somebody that you have similar expectations of what this leasing arrangement is going to look like.
There's some great comments in the chat. So if you have the capability to read some of those, I would encourage that. The next question is, what is the going rate on how farm managers are paid? Sometimes farm manager overcharges and underdelivers. So do you have any idea of where they're at on the pay scale?
I don't know. I know they charge as a percentage of the lease amount. So, you know, they have an economic incentive to the landowner to get them a good, fair lease rate. But just like with interviewing your potential tenants, you're going to want to interview a potential farm manager and make sure that they have a similar philosophy to what makes sense for you in terms of managing that property.
So here in Nebraska, locally, they charge anywhere from 7.5% to 10%. And again, it depends on what services they are providing. And there's different levels of services that they will work with you on. So sometimes you need to make sure you know exactly what services they're providing along with that management. How can excuse me, how can you find a good mentor with farming? And this will be our last question for the evening.
How can you find a good mentor with farming? Well, I'm going to point to Extension in that respect and say that if there's somebody that you're looking for to help you with farming, Extension is a really good place to start. I'll kind of wrap up with this story. I received a phone call from a gal who lived out in, she owned ground in South Central Kansas, but she lived in California. And she got me on the phone and said, I need to know everything there is to know about agriculture. And I said, well, that's a lot. Tell me what you're thinking. And she was a very, she owned her own business. She was a very accomplished professional woman. And she made that very clear to me. And then she said, but I am intimidated by my farmer. And what she needed was a mentor. She needed somebody that could help kind of step her through what farming was all about so that she needed a way to feel comfortable having a conversation with the tenant. She just didn't even feel comfortable with that first step. And so, you know, in Extension, I think that we have a lot of experience ourselves, but we also know a lot of people. And that's one of the things that we can help connect you up with. And that's what I would say. But Jessica, you can add to that.
It's perfect.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you, Mykel, for joining us. I do want to take a few minutes here before we allow Indiana and Kansas to return to their sessions. And you might have this week received a book in the mail. You are receiving the book Getting to Yes as a part of this program. And we encourage you, if you are in the position where you need to negotiate a lease, and you'd like some more hard skills on how to negotiate, that you take advantage of that book. Nebraska is also offering a free book club for anyone to join. That book club session will take place the afternoon of March 20th. So we've got a few weeks for you to read the book, and we will have a discussion led by Callie Thorne out of North Dakota, and she'll walk us through applying the lessons that we learn in getting to yes to our ag operations and the negotiations that we're doing in agriculture. So I'm going to leave that up on the screen for a few minutes. You can scan the QR code, or you can go to the link on the screen, and if someone can copy that into the chat box for me, you can also register there. You will need to be registered to receive that link, and we appreciate anyone and welcome anyone to join us for that book club.